Clint Eastwood, the towering titan who etched his name into film history, has long been feared and respected in Hollywood. But even legends have rivals behind the scenes, where fierce battles raged but were kept out of the public eye. Now that Eastwood is getting close to 100 years old and counting down the days to his death, he has finally spoken out against the co-stars who made him angry and who he swore he would never fight again. Clint Eastwood Jr. was born screaming on May 31, 1930 in a San Francisco hospital. Weighed 11 pounds 6 ounces and was so big that he lay there with his little fist balled up like he was ready for anything. His parents, Ruth and Clinton Sr., named him Samson after the biblical giant. Ruth would later tell friends that giving birth almost broke her and that she felt a strange mix of pride and fear when she held him for the first time because he seemed so big. Clinton Sr. just smiled and said that their boy was destined for something amazing, but neither of them knew how much pain he would be in. His family lived in Piedmont, California. Clinton Sr. worked long hours in manufacturing, hauling steel and sweat to make money, and Ruth had a steady job at IBM. They had a swimming pool in the backyard and belonged to a country club. There were 2 cars in the driveway, one for each parent. Clint was the oldest of 2 children and had a little sister named Jean who followed him around like a shadow. Their roots were deep, with ancestors from England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Clint was a 12th grader. Even though things were stable around him, a pool, a club, and cars, he felt restless, like they were chains holding him back from something bigger. His quiet life didn't last long, though, because the 1930s came on quickly. The Great Depression tore through families, and Clinton Sr. had to look for work wherever it came up. He and his family had to leave their comfortable Piedmont home and move from town to town, living in a rented house here and a cramped apartment there until they found something better. When they finally got back to Piedmont, Clinton was still young enough to remember how painful it was to leave friends behind. He carried the weight of those years of wandering around in his chest. His parents tried to keep things stable for him and Jean, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant for something rougher, something that would test him in ways that Piedmont could never do. Ruth would catch him staring off into space and ask what he was thinking, but he would just shrug and say nothing because he didn't know. Still, school was the first real battleground for Clint. He wasn't made for death desks, rules, or teachers going on and on about things he didn't want to learn. At Piedmont Middle School, he struggled so much that his grade dropped and he was held back a year. Being stuck there with a pencil in his hand and a teacher's voice in his ear when all he wanted to do was run wild made him angry. Things got worse when he moved up to Piedmont High School, because that's where the rebel in him really woke up and started acting out. One day he wrote something so rude on a wall that it turned the principal's face purple. He then went even further by setting fire to an effigy right on the football field. The smoke curling up into the sky was a sign to everyone watching that he wasn't going to give in. The school kicked him out quickly and hard, and his parents didn't know whether to yell or cry when they heard about it. He went to Oakland Technical High School next and planned to graduate in mid-1949, but no one knows for sure if he ever walked that stage. His records are missing pieces, and his classmates remember him as the tall, quiet kid who didn't care about books or bells. Years later, Bell's biographer Patrick McGilligan tried to look into it, but ran into trouble when someone from Clint's production company told him to stop, implying that there were things about those days that Clint didn't want anyone to see. Before the world could figure him out, Clint did any job he could find. He sat lifeguard on beaches. As a paper carrier, he carried newspapers through the streets, getting black ink on his hands. He also worked as a grocery clerk, stacking cans and counting change, and then as a forest firefighter, swinging an axe through smoke and heat until his lungs hurt. His next job was as a golf caddy, carrying bags for rich men who barely looked at him. Each job taught him something about grit and survival that school never could. Ruth would see him come home tired and dirty, and she'd ask him if he was okay, but he'd just nod and say he wasn't sure how to tell her that he was chasing something he couldn't catch, but those jobs made him stronger for the fights that were to come. Then the Korean War happened in 1951, and Clint was drafted into the Army. His name was on a list, and he was sent to Fort Ord in Northern California to become a lifeguard, just like he had been before. His parents were relieved that he wasn't in the middle of it, but Clint felt the weight of that luck like a stone in his chest. Being stationed at Fort Ord wasn't all duty, but it did give him freedom to pursue something else: women. Clint turned Fort Orr into his own hunting ground, going after anyone who caught his eye. But the big catch was an officer's daughter, a girl with golden hair and a laugh that could be heard across the base. She was trouble wrapped in a pretty package, and they'd meet in secret behind barracks or by the water where no one could see. She fell hard for him. While he was acting normally, rumors spread that she worked behind the scenes to keep him out of combat. Her dad had rank and she had sway, and Clint let it happen because it meant staying alive. Ruth heard the rumors and shook her head, but Clinton Sr. just laughed and said, "Boy, he didn't know how deep those jokes would cut later." Trouble found him anyway when he took a bomber flight out of Seattle. The plane ran out of fuel in the air and the engines coughing and dying as it fell toward the ocean. Clint and the pilot kicked free of the wreck as cold waves tried to pull them under. They swam for their lives, salt burning their eyes and lungs screaming for air, until they hit the shore, half dead and shivering. He made it back to Fort Ord and was released in February 1953. That close call with death shook him up more than he'd admit. He'd sometimes sit alone and stare at nothing with his hands clenched tight, and it left a mark that wouldn't go away. When he got home, his parents gave him a big hug, but he didn't care because he didn't want them to know how close he was to not coming back at all. The next big event in his life happened by accident in Hollywood. It began back at Fort Orr. According to one story, a Universal camera crew was filming nearby, and an assistant saw him as tall and lean with a quiet fire in his eyes and dragged him over to meet the director. His official bio says it was Chuck Hill. Chuck had moved to Los Angeles and ran into Clint again. One day, he snuck him past the gates at Universal Studios and introduced him to Irving Glassberg, a cameraman who knew talent when he saw it. Irving set up an audition with director Arthur Lubin, who took one look at Clint's 6'4" frame and decided he was worth a shot. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though, because Lubin wasn't shy about telling Clint he was stiff when he watched him try to act. Clint stood there taking the criticism with clenched teeth and a twist in his stomach because he really wanted this role so badly, even though he didn't know how to show it yet. Lubin saw something in him. Maybe it was the way he filled the room, and told him to take drama classes and come back when he wasn't so green. That audition led to a $100 a week contract in April 1954, and Clint grabbed it like a lifeline, even though doubts kept coming in. He had a low voice and wooden movements, and he'd grit his teeth when he talked, which made them laugh at first. Later, gritting became his trademark, but back then it was just nerves. He'd go home after those long days and stare at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made a mistake and if this dream was just another job he'd fail at like the ones he'd left behind. Ruth called to check on him, and he'd say he was fine, but she could hear he pushed through, though, because that's what he did. He started landing small parts that kept the fire alive. His first big audition was for 6 Bridges to Cross in May 1954, but director Joseph Pevey took one look and said, "No thanks." He bounced back with a small role in Revenge of the Creature in 1955, the sequel to a monster hit. If you squint, you can see him. He was just a lab tech who barely gets a line. He showed up in Lady Godiva of Coventry as Jonesy, a sailor, and in Tarantula as a pilot with no name or credit. Each job was a step forward. His next big break came when he appeared on Allen in Movieland with stars like Steve Allen and Tony Curtis in July 1955. He stood tall and silent, trying not to look out of place. Universal kept him around for a while, but on October 23, 1955, they fired him with a letter and a handshake. He walked out of the studio with his head down and his guts in knots. Rejection hit him like a punch he'd fought. The door had been slammed shut, and he didn't know if he'd ever get back inside. When he told his parents how he felt, they tried to cheer him up, but he just shrugged and said he'd figure it out. What happened next would test him even more. A story where the climb gets steeper and the falls cut deeper. For days on end, he was going from one agency to the next, trying to find a foothold in a town that didn't care about him. He signed up with the Marsh Agency first, hoping they'd get him. He got steady work in a few small parts in movies like The Traveling Sales Lady and Escapade in Japan. He also showed up on TV shows like Reader's Digest and Highway Patrol, in roles so small that you'd miss him if you blink. But nothing stuck. The money was barely enough to keep the gas in his tank, and the rejections kept coming in like unpaid bills. So he switched agencies, first to Irving Leonard, then to Kuma Lank, and finally to Mitchell Gizez. With each move, he was desperate to find something better. He kept auditioning, but kept getting turned down. He was down, and every time he drove home, he'd look at the Hollywood sign in the distance and wonder if he'd ever make it, or if he was just wasting his time chasing a mirage. It was a daily grind that left him hungry and restless, but Clint wasn't the type to give up. He kept going and fighting, even when it seemed like everyone was against him. In 1959, he got a part on Maverick as a cowardly bad guy. It wasn't a big part, but he made it his own, and casting directors and a few fans noticed. It gave him hope. But then came Ambush at Sarin Pass in 1958. A cheap Western that he'd later call the lowest point of his career. He hated it because it made him feel like a failure all over again. That was the bottom, he'd say years later, his voice tight with disgust. He was clawing his way up inch by inch, a man caught between promise and failure. He was feeling hopeless when he got the call that would change his life and put him in a whole new kind of pain. In the summer of 1958, Clint was cast as Rowdy Y in Rawhide, a new CBS Western series. Within 3 weeks, the show was in the top 20, and by 1961, it had hit number 6 in the ratings. It was a hit for 7 years until it was canceled in 1965, 1966, and Clint was its star. People loved Rowdy, the young, clumsy cowboy with a big heart, but Clint didn't like the character. He hated how the show was put together. To the world, Clint was a name and a face on TV screens across America, but on the inside he was miserable, stuck in a role that felt like a straitjacket. His success was real, but it came with chains that he could feel getting tighter every day he stepped onto that set. The work was brutal. 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, he was out there driving cattle and delivering lines to make Rowdy matter, and by the end of the run, he was making $119,000 an episode plus severance. Was a huge paycheck for someone who had once lived on almost nothing, but it didn't make things better. He wanted more than just a fat bank account. He wanted control. He begged the producers to let him direct. He even cut some trailers to show he could handle it, but they said no, telling him that he'd always be Rowdy Yates. It drove him crazy. After a long day, he'd smoke a cigarette and stare at the walls. Dreaming of a way to get out, Rawhide was his big break, but it was also a prison, and the longer he stayed, the worse it got for him. He was a star, but he felt like a puppet, and that anger turned into something dark and heavy. By 1963, the show was falling apart, the ratings started going down, and the writers stopped being creative. When it was finally canceled in the middle of the season in 1965, 1966, Clint didn't cry. He took his last paycheck, brushed off his boots, and walked away without looking back. What came next would take him higher than he'd ever imagined. Clint got an offer that seemed crazy. Sergio Leone, an Italian director that no one in Hollywood knew about, wanted to cast him in a Western called A Fistful of Dollars. His Rawhide co-star Eric Fleming turned it down, but Clint saw it as a chance to get away for $115,000 and a Mercedes. He flew to Spain and became the man with no name, a loner with a cigar and a gun. The movie came out in 1964 and shattered all the ideas people had about what a Western was. Audiences couldn't get enough of it. It was raw, violent, and morally gray. And Clint jumped into the unknown, and it paid off big. Leon brought him back for a few dollars more in 1965, and then The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly came out in 1966. Each movie was bigger, bloodier, and better than the last. The trilogy made millions of dollars and made him a global star, but it wasn't easy working with Leon. The director was a perfectionist who insisted on take after take, pushing Clint to the edge. They'd argue and glare at each other. On set, two stubborn men were locked in a quiet war. It worked on screen, but off-screen, tension was building up, and later, Leon offered Clint Once Upon a Time in the West. Clint said no, saying he was done with Westerns for a while and ready to try something new. Leon saw this as a betrayal, and their friendship fell apart. Critics loved the style of the trilogy, but some called Clint's acting wooden, which hit him harder than he'd admit. He changed the game and made history, but he lost Allie and hurt his pride back in America. But he didn't waste any time healing. In 1968, he starred in Hang 'em High, a Western that showed he could carry a movie on his own. It was a hit, solidifying his stardom. Then came Coogan Bluff, his first team-up with Don Siegel. Clint was now a titan unstoppable, or so it seemed. Off-screen, Clint's life was a firestorm. It started in 1968 on The Beguiled, where he fought with director Romay Gary. Gary was a control freak who fussed over every detail, while Clint wanted room to separate the set. The set was tense, and then Jean Seberg walked on. She was beautiful and fragile, and she was Gary's wife. But that didn't stop the sparks. Clint and Jean began an affair, sneaking off between takes because they were too close to ignore. When Gary found out, he lost it and challenged Clint to a fight right there on the set. Clint refused because he didn't want to delay the film, but the damage was already done. Jean begged him to leave his wife and build a life with her, but he couldn't. She filed for divorce from Gary, hoping that he would change his mind. Clint would follow, but he didn't. She left him heartbroken, and Clint carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. It was a taste of the pain that was to come, a warning he didn't heed. Then there was Sergio Leone, the man who made him famous. They had worked together like magic, but by the end, it was like a war zone, and Clint had to take charge. They barely spoke after that, and their relationship turned to ashes. Clint moved on and started directing his own movies, including Play Misty for Me in 1971 and High Plains Drifter in 1973. Leon, envious that Clint was taking his style, watched from afar. It was a rivalry that would forever change Westerns. Two giants who couldn't share the stage, but that wasn't even close to the storm in Clint's personal life. A storm called Sandra Locke that would tear him apart years later. In 2008, another fight broke out, this time with Spike Lee. Clint had directed Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, twin films about the Battle of Iwo Jima. Lee called him out at Cannes. Angry that black soldiers weren't in an interview, Clint replied that the military was segregated, black troops didn't fight on Iwo Jima, and he wasn't going to change history for anyone. Lee hit back harder, calling him an angry old man digging into old wounds. The fight became public, loud, and ugly over race and the truth. Clint stood his ground, but the words hurt like another blow to a life already full of them. It was a distraction from the real war he'd fought decades earlier, the one that still haunted him. In the 1970s, John Wayne, who played the king of classic westerns with straight jaws and strong morals, became Clint's biggest enemy. Wayne hated Clint's dark and messy movies like High Plains Drifter, 1973, so he wrote Clint a letter saying, "This isn't what the West was about." Clint didn't care. He saw Wayne as a relic stuck in the past. He pitched the Hostiles a story about an old rancher and a young gambler, hoping Wayne would agree, but Wayne flat out said no, hating Clint's whole vibe. Clint kept making movies and pushing the genre forward, but Wayne's rejection stuck with him as a reminder that not everyone was happy about his success. It hurt, but it was child's play compared to the heartbreak that would define him. Now we come to the real tragedy that broke Clint Eastwood in a way that nothing else could. The Sandra Locke saga. It began in 1975 on the set of Outlaw J.Y. Wales. Sandra was 31 years old, a delicate blonde with an Oscar, and she was Nod from The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Clint was 45 years old and married. She played his love interest, and as soon as they locked eyes, something clicked. They didn't just act it, they felt it. They started talking, laughing, and having late-night coffees, which turned into something more. Within weeks, they were together, a couple in every way. Clint moved her into his house and left his wife Maggie behind. For 14 years, they were together all the time, making 6 movies together, including The Gauntlet and Every Which Way But Loose. They had great chemistry on Any Which Way You Can, Bronco Billy's sudden impact as Deadpool, and Sandra was his inspiration and partner. She trusted him completely and gave him her heart, career, and future. He promised her the world, and for a while it felt real, but Clint wasn't the man she thought he was. Behind her back, he was cheating on her with women he met on sets, in bars, and anywhere else he could. He kept Sandra in the dark and made her think they were together. Sandra cooked him dinner, planned their next project, and fell asleep in his arms, not realizing that he was telling her lies. Then, in 1989, the truth hit her like a wrecking ball. He had 2 kids, Kyle and Allison, with Jacelyn Reeves, a flight attendant he'd been seeing for years. It wasn't a fling. It was a whole secret life that she'd built while she was loving him. She confronted him in the kitchen, crying and shaking. "How could you do this to me after everything?" He just stood there. She screamed and begged him to say something to make things better, but he wouldn't. He just turned around and walked away, leaving her crying on the floor, her world in pieces. Sandra didn't give up easily. She fought to save them. Every day, she called him, pleading for a chance. "I can forgive you," she'd say in a broken voice. "We can get past this." But Clint was done. He moved out, cut her off, and acted like she didn't exist. She was left alone, abandoned by the man she had given 14 years of her life. She sued him for Palamon in 1989, asking for half of what they'd built together. It was a nasty fight with lawyers making bad claims. Clint settled in 1990, giving her her money and a directing deal with Warner Brothers. She thought it was a lifeline and a chance to start over, but it wasn't. The deal was a scam, and Clint had manipulated things so that none of her projects ever got made. She pitched ideas and worked late nights, only to see them fail one after another. He had tricked her and controlled her even after he had thrown her away, and she didn't know it. It wasn't until 1995 that Sandra sued him again, this time for fraud. She stood in court and told everyone how he had ruined her. He took my career, my dignity, everything. The case was settled out of court in 1996, and more money was exchanged, but it didn't help her. In 1997, she wrote a book called I Was a Fool to Think He'd Ever Put Me First, in which she talked about all of her problems. People loved it, but Clint didn't say a word, letting the storm rage around him. Inside, he was falling apart. He'd sit in his big, empty house and look at old pictures of them, playing her words over and over in his head. Nights were the worst. He'd pour whiskey and pace the halls, wondering how he'd let things get so bad. He'd built a wall around himself, but it didn't stop the pain from getting in. Sandra's life fell apart after that. She did a few acting jobs and directing jobs, but the spark was gone. She had trusted Clint with her dreams, and he had crushed them. In 2013, she did an interview, her voice soft but husky. She said, "There were good times, but the price was too high. I lost who I was." She died in 2018 at age 74 after years of quiet struggle with cancer. Clint didn't go to the funeral because he couldn't face it. He knew deep down that he had betrayed her and hurt her, and now she was gone. The man who had stood up to gunslingers and critics without blinking was brought to his knees by the memory of the woman he had loved and lost. That heartbreak didn't stop his career, though. He kept going. In 1971, Dirty Harry made him an icon, and in 2008, Untouchable Gran Torino showed that he could still carry a film at age 78. He directed, acted, produced, and won a lot of Oscars and praise, but the controversy stuck. Fights with Lee, feuds with Wayne, and the mess with Sandra made him look like a man who wouldn't bend and would do what he wanted no matter what. He was a legend, no doubt, and he had taken over Hollywood, but at night, he wasn't the man with no name. He was just Clint. A man haunted by the decisions he'd made and the people he'd hurt. Sandra's face stayed with him, her voice echoing in the silence, "You did this," and he knew she was right. His legacy is a tower built on conflict, triumphs, and deep scars. He changed westerns with the trilogy, action with Dirty Harry, and stories in his own way with movies like Unforgiven, 1992, which won him Best Picture and Best Director. He's still working like a titan at 94 years old, 2025, but the idea is only half the story. The real Clint Eastwood was a man who fought for everything and won more than most. He paid a price, though, and Sandra was the biggest price he couldn't avoid.